Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Work From Home Show. Shout out to all our homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, all the work from homers out there. I'm Naresh Vissa. Today we have Christine Platt and Catherine Wiggington Greene on the show. Christine Platt is known as the Afrominimalist. She is a managing director for the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University, executive director for Baldwin for the Arts, former senior policy advisor for the U.S. Department of Energy, and #1 bestselling author of The Story of Martin Luther King Jr., a biography book for new readers, as well as the book The Story of Harriet Tubman, a biography book for new readers, and the Afrominimalist Guide to Living with Less. Catherine Wiggington Greene's feature documentary, I'm Not Racist, Am I?, continues to be used throughout the U.S. as a teaching tool for starting racial dialogue. They are both the co-authors of the new book, Rebecca, Not Becky. So Christine Platt and Catherine Wiggington Greene, thank you so much for joining us on the Work From Home Show.
Hi, thanks for having us.
A lot to get to today. Both of you are very accomplished in your own rights. We've had maybe 1 or 2 episodes about diversity in the workplace, not much about DEI. I know a lot about these topics, at least I think. I'll probably learn a lot more from you guys. But let's first start with the bios that I read for both of you. And I want to start with Catherine, because your documentary, I'm Not Racist, Am I? I read the synopsis. It sounds interesting. I want to check it out. Is it on Netflix or Prime or anything like that?
Well, thank you for asking about the film. Actually, when we made the documentary, we agreed that we would never actually have it available on streaming services and things like that, because it was very important for us to not only have people watch the film, but also engage in dialogue with one another. So the only way to watch it for years was to bring us to whatever community, school, corporation, office, and screen the film, and then lead people, facilitate a dialogue among the community about the issues that were raised during the film. Now we've opened it up a little bit. So if you go to my website, which is catherinewiggintongreen.com, there are ways to engage with the film. They're slightly a little bit more accessible, but part of that really is saying, okay, but we want you to agree to engage in dialogue about the film. It follows a group of teenagers through a school year of race, exploring race and racism. And what we found is that adults have so much to learn from what the students in the film went through and how they talked about these issues. And so that continues to this day. Even we made it 10 years ago, but we still do screenings all the time and leading dialogue, because these issues aren't going anywhere. They just, change.
How did you two link up? Walk us through that history.
Well, I actually screened the film. Yeah, sure. So I screened. Christine was working at the Anti-Racism Center for Policy Research, and she was putting together a huge event that they brought a lot of authors from around the country who were publishing books and writing about these issues and structural racism. And she invited us to screen I'm Not Racist, Am I? At that Anti-Racist Book Festival. And that's when we first met.
Yeah, that's when we first met. That's how our friendship started. It's so funny, even though I am no longer at the center, I think because I was one of the founding members, folks still think I'm there. So just want to make that correction that I am only the executive director for Baldwin for the Arts at the moment, but
Okay.
Continue to partner with and champion my colleagues that are still at the center. It's a wonderful opportunity. I had a chance to meet folks like Catherine, who were just doing amazing work and really approaching anti-racism through a very different lens, and that's how we ended up working on this book together. It was 2020. The world was on fire. I was at the center and just, kept hearing, people wanted to know, like, how did we get here? How did we get here? And as a historian, that's always just one of my favorite questions, right? I know that folks need to know the history of this country. They need to know the history of systemic racism. They need to be able to put those pieces to the puzzle together first, right? And so, yeah, at the time, just having a lot of conversations about this, and that's how the idea for the book was initially birthed. But it was actually my agent who suggested that I co-author the book, and she was like, "Is there anyone that you have in mind? You keep talking about your schedule is so busy, you're not going to have time. Is there anyone that you could like co-author it with?" And the minute she made that suggestion, I immediately thought of Catherine.
And the book is Rebecca, Not Becky. Is this a novel or is it a children's book? Tell us more.
It's a novel. It is a novel. And it's a, I don't know, Catherine, I mean, it's a teaching tool, but it's not a teaching tool. Like we've had so many conversations around using fiction and storytelling as a teaching tool. And so I don't know, Catherine, jump in and share a bit about that. Cause I don't want to
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, I mean it's a novel for adults. And what we found though, even though we both have worked in the realm of nonfiction, right, with Christine with a lot of her historical work for children, but also her other nonfiction, creative nonfiction for adults. And then I have, making documentaries. But what we found was the beauty of this novel was being able to really dig into the psyches of these women and their relationships in the community they live in a way that, I think sometimes even though it's fiction, because we get to know these women so deeply and they're fully fleshed out characters who are composites of all the people that we recognize in our environment and as well as ourselves, that we get closer to the truth about people's experiences and their feelings with fiction.
This is a question specifically for Christine. You did write a book called The Afrominimalist Guide to Living with Less.
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and what are your rules for minimalism?
Yes, that book was sort of birthed out of my experience with minimalism being very white, literally and figuratively. And I wanted to really find a way to make minimalism my own. And I think going on that journey allowed me to see that there's really a difference between the aesthetics of minimalism and then the actual practice of minimalism, right? Like we tend to see a lot, I would say, online, like when we think of Pinterest and we think of some of these places, we tend to see a lot of the aesthetics of minimalism, but people who are practicing minimalist, there is no real color palette sort of thing, right? And so my own personal journey led me to write that book, which is to focus on authenticity over aesthetics, to have a holistic process for letting go of things that no longer serve us. And yeah, that's the Afro Minimalist Guide to Living with Less. And it's obviously still a practicing minimalist, and it was a beautiful journey, and it's been wonderful to see so many people who thought they couldn't be minimalist, who thought it was impossible to embrace the journey of living with less.
I consider myself to be a minimalist. It's just hard to be a minimalist when you're married to someone who's not a minimalist and have children who don't know what being a minimalist means, young children.
Yes, I have heard this many, many times. Yes, it is a challenge, but it's similar to what we're showing in Rebecca Not Becky. All of these areas, like we learn by modeling. You know what I mean? And so, like, I always tell people, someone else, they're like, well, how do I get my spouse to be a minimalist? And I'm like, live your minimalist journey and allow them to see how much more intentional and purposeful your life is, right? And people will be like, wow, I want to be like that. I want to be able to get dressed in 5 minutes instead of standing in front of my closet for 45 minutes, right? I mean, I think there are so many parallels, and that's what makes storytelling so beautiful, right? It allows people to see themselves and to see where they can make changes within themselves, right, through the lives of other characters, or in my situation, with the Afro Minimalist Guide, through me, I heard so many of the same things, right? Like, oh, I remember being that person, or when you said you put one handbag inside of the other handbag, I laughed. That was me. It's the same sort of thing, right? Where we're allowing people to see themselves and see what's on the other side if they are willing to embrace the journey.
Let's talk diversity, DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, inclusion. I'll tell you that I'm not a proponent of diversity programs, DEI. I went through them myself. I was part when I was younger, actually probably the same age as Rebecca. I was in various diversity clubs, went to diversity conferences, did the whole deal. And then as I got older, I just kind of outgrew that phase and find them to be actually very counterproductive. So let's start with, tell us more about DEI. I brought it up, what it stands for, but tell us more about what it is, what the goal is, and if it really works.
You know, when people ask the question about whether or not DEI works, I just think that's such a great start to the conversation about, like, you know, tell me a little bit more about what it means to say that something works. You know, so when we ask that question, or when I see articles that say DEI doesn't work, I really wonder, like, well, what are we measuring here? What does it mean for something to work or not work? And from there, I like to just focus on, oh, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve? So when we say something doesn't work, when we say, DEI didn't work, well, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about we didn't get more diversity within our ranks of employees? Does that mean we don't have enough people in leadership who are from a number of different backgrounds, and we still are predominantly white or predominantly male or both? And then from there, we can have that conversation, right? Not saying like, well, the DEI didn't work. It's that let's just get specific about what it is we're trying to achieve. What outcomes do we want? What are our goals? What do we want people to feel like when they're working in this place? And so that's where I think we can change the conversation, really expand it. So I think that education does work, and a lot of programming does work, and connection building activities can work and can be really effective for groups when we're all really clear about what it is we're trying to create and build together. I think one area that concerns me is when people talk about DEI as training, because then that is where we tend to focus on whether or not something works or does not work, which is to say, if I'm telling you that after an hour-long DEI training on bias, that at the end of the training, you will be able to recognize XYZ, you will be able to behave XYZ. And here I am predicting what it is you will be able to do and understand after an hour. And that is not effective when we're talking about people's identity and experiences in the workplace. And when we're trying to really ultimately come to a place of shifting policies and structures and practices and systems that we know aren't serving everybody and might actually be keeping people from joining our organizations because they don't feel like it's a place for them. So that's kind of where I am in that conversation. And I've worked with a lot of companies, Fortune 500 firms and government agencies and nonprofits over the past several years. And that's why I always try and push back and say, I'm not giving you a training. I can't tell you how to feel. I can't tell you how you're going to act or what you're going to be able to know how to do when we're talking about identity.
I've got to say, Catherine, that was a great answer, because I think many people, when they think of DEI, when they read the mainstream news media or watch something, they're like some buzzwords that they think DEI means. DEI means filling quotas. It means affirmative action. It means, you brought up training, training about white people, whiteness. We'll talk about that. But I just find those buzzwords to be very counterproductive, whereas the way you put it was more so you tied it into the bottom line. And we're the work from home show. Our listeners are business owners. When you're a remote company, it's obviously harder to have diversity. I would say my company is just naturally diverse because I just hire the best people, and all around the world, not just the United States. So I really like that answer a lot, and I'll let Christine add to what we just said.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, Catherine and I are in agreement on this, and I think that was one of the reasons that we became colleagues and friends first, right? Is that we saw where some of the struggles were, and I should also mention that a lot of the DEI that folks experienced, especially in the wake of George Floyd and post George Floyd, you know, it was after this work had become very commodified, right? And we've seen in any industry, like once there is an opportunity for it to become commodified, it sort of just becomes its own animal and its own beast. But it's so important that we remember that historically this work has been going on for a long time, right? And it has always been collaborative work. It has always been collective work, right? And, Catherine and I, just right off the bat, like, I remember us having a conversation, if racism could be dismantled in an hour, like we wouldn't be here, right? So even it's managing the expectations around some of these conversations and trainings and workshops, right? Whatever you want to call it, right? And I think, what we've seen and what people are feeling is this sort of like DEI fatigue, because there were people who had good intentions, who leaned into it, who really thought like, oh man, if I give this 1 hour workshop on unconscious bias, everyone in this room is going to understand it and go out and apply it in their lives, right? And, there's this fatigue that comes with talking about it, that comes with being a part of these programs and feeling like nothing has happened. Right. And so I think it's so important to manage expectations around some of these conversations, because the education is important. It's the expectation around what the attendee is going to get, how they are going to walk away with it, how are they going to be able to implement it into their own lives and livelihoods. That is where the work really begins,
Yeah, that makes sense. When it comes to DEI, CRT, even to an extent BLM, these three-letter acronyms, again, buzzwords. A lot of the buzzwords is that you're learning just anti-white type of information. What is whiteness, first off? I believe you guys have defined it previously. What is whiteness, and why the obsession over white?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start here. I just want to say, with the acronym soup, right? Part of it is some of these terms and terminologies, even parts of this movement, were never meant to become mainstream, right? A lot of this is like academia. Critical race theory is rooted in academia, right? And it is a very particular discipline and practice, right? A lot of organizations that have been historically grassroots organizations were thrust onto, into the spotlight, right? And so I don't want to make light of the people who have really been doing incredibly important work when it comes to the many different lanes and intersections of, race, racism, anti-racism, dismantling some of these policies and practices. And so I really just wanted to first and foremost, say that. Catherine, I know you're about to jump right in and answer the question directly, so I'll let you
Yeah,
take
no,
back over.
I love the point you're making. It's interesting in this field how these things that were highly specialized and really, academic and scholarly, and people really thinking about the analysis, when it becomes mainstream, it gets into the hands of people who don't quite understand it. And so I would say for anyone who's in any other industry, you could draw a parallel, right? I mean, I know how to balance my checkbook, but I'm not a CFO, right? And my husband would say that sometimes people who think that they understand, finances might actually do more harm if they're trying to establish systems and practices around operations and billing in their own environment. And so we want to make sure that we move away from only staying in that realm of the acronyms, but then people take the acronyms, and it can be very powerful to have an acronym or a term to describe something that you're studying It's very empowering, and it's also very clarifying when you're within that context. But then taken out of context, people use it, and then they do it. Sometimes it happens in a way that's kind of dismissive, and so I want to make sure we aren't, kind of enabling that as well. When you asked about whiteness, I think about, when I was growing up, I grew up in Denver, Colorado, in mostly white neighborhood. My schools were racially diverse because I was in public schools. But I do know that when I thought about race, I always assumed when we talked about race, we were talking about people who were not white, and that everything else was a race, but that white was not a race. And so when people talk about whiteness in academia and people who are doing this kind of work, it's to say, well, white is also a category. And we only think of white as normal and like the baseline, and then everybody else is different from that. That's why people have pushed back and said, let's also talk about being white. And it's not about attacking people for being white. It's not about saying anything's wrong with being white. It's just saying that there are all of these racial categories, as there are categories for lots of things. And we have to also describe that, right? That was a very, it's not biological to be white, just like it's not biological to be black. And so when we only say that things are categories when they aren't white, then we forget that all of it was actually invented to keep us apart. So that's what we mean when we talk about whiteness.
Yeah, well, I was going to
Oh,
say,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that I do feel that when we do categorize people, of course, we see what we see, but when we start categorizing people as these are the whites, these are the blacks, these are the browns, and look, I'm a brown-skinned man, but that could mean a brown-skinned Ashkenazi Jew. It could be a brown-skinned Hispanic, Mexican. I'm Indian. It could be Middle Eastern. There are even brown-skinned people identify as black or African American. So that's where it gets confusing. And when we're talking about whiteness, I would say there are, 50 shades of everything, 50 shades of brown, 50 shades of white, 50 shades of black. So when someone boxes me into, oh, you're brown, so therefore you are X, Y, and Z, or you think like X, Y, and Z, I say that's just not true, because there are 50 shades of brown, or there are 50 shades. I'm Indian, so Indian American, so there are 50 shades of being Indian. There's no one way to be Indian. So that's
right. Absolutely. We don't want to reduce people. We also know that we're not really talking about colors of the rainbow, right? We're not talking about actual colors. We're talking about what are the social constructs that have decided to categorize in certain ways. And so you're calling that out, saying, we're human. And it isn't really about skin color. It's about social constructs that have meant to put us in separate categories so that we can kind of divide, right, and conquer.
Yeah. But I think this is where, Catherine and I always talk about like understanding the history, like this historical aspect of it is so important, right? So getting people to understand, like, for when someone is entering this work, right? Yes, it at first blush, it is about skin color, right? And so sometimes that is where I start, right? Getting people to understand that the white in reference to a person literally did not come into our conversation and lexicon until 1671, right? That is when the Oxford English Dictionary, that is where you find the first appearance in print of the adjective white in reference to a white man, right? And we know the history of this country, right? We know that it was the 1400s, right? When we had English indentured servants and enslaved Africans coming over, right? So we have this historical timeline that we can actually follow. And one of the things that, I said one of the things before. We talk about many things when we're doing this work, but, Catherine and I also get people to understand some of these terms and terminology that are being, at least what I saw, weaponized, right? And so that weaponization of a term like white privilege, right, is what makes people resistant and recalcitrant to wanting to learn more about it, right? And to understand, like, if you are immediately led to feeling guilty, there is automatically this resistance to learning, right? So we get people to like, well, let's talk about Bacon's Rebellion. Let's talk about the origins of white privilege and get folks to understand how it even came about, and also why it is systemic, right? And so I think there are so many layers and complexities to it, which is why when some of this work and some of this terminology becomes mainstream without that historical context, without having that scholarly lens, it can be very harmful and detrimental, not just to people, but also to the movement itself, right? And so that's what we're trying to show through this novel and through our individual and collective work, right? That all of this is sort of centered. We have to talk about it, and we have to have real, honest, and authentic conversations. And I have to be in, if I'm giving even a workshop, and I say, does anyone know the origins of white privilege? Like, if hands go up and all they give me is a definition, and I say, has anyone heard of Bacon's Rebellion? I need people to be honest and say no. And then we can really start getting to the root causes, right? We can't dismantle anything until we know the root of how it was built and what is holding it together.
Well, you bring up white privilege. We talked about whiteness. So can you define white privilege?
Yeah, I mean, when people talk about white privilege, they're talking about the ways that those of us who are white, that things haven't been as hard for us because of our race. So it's not to say that I haven't had struggles in my life growing up, lower income, raised by a single mom, right? Those are all parts of my experience, but things weren't hard because of my race. And there are ways that things are structured. I often compare it to thinking about physical disability. So it is much easier for me to move around the world because I do not use a wheelchair. And anybody who has ever broken a bone or had surgery and been in a cast, this is the first time people often say, oh my gosh, I cannot believe how hard it is to move around and how inaccessible even places that are stating that they are accessible are, right? The world is built for people who are moving around on two legs and who are a certain height and can reach things and can move through certain spaces. And then once you find yourself in a place where you don't have as much mobility or you're using a wheelchair, you realize how much stuff isn't structured for you. And so I think that is similar to the experience of being white, but there are many things, not everything, that are have been less of an obstacle for me because of my race. Now, I will say that I don't engage in these conversations by just telling people, oh, you have white privilege or I have white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, what happens when we only rely on the terminology and these definitions is that they lose their meaning and people throw them around, weaponize them, as Christine said, as a way to, have an off ramp from the conversation and instead say, okay, well, let me just talk about the thing, right? We're in the workplace. We realize that we have way too many people in our particular organization that are in leadership roles who are white men. And it just doesn't seem like that work. Like, why is the path there easier when we have a lot of people who are interested and capable of having these roles? And so let's just talk about what it is in our mentoring programming or in our hiring policies and practices or in our retention, in the way that we're treating our employees. What is it that might be preventing us from having the kind of workplace that we want to have, and have that conversation? That's about relationships. That's about context. That is not about saying, oh, you've got white privilege.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because I think language is so important when we have these conversations, right? Like, getting people to say white privilege is a term, right? Like, just reducing it down to its most basic levels, because there is sort of this element of guilt, this weighted guilt, right? And we see it play out through our characters, some of the characters in the story, right? It's a term that is used for unearned advantages that a person is granted because of his or her whiteness, right? Or ability to pass as white, right? So when we talk about white privilege as a term, when we talk about it as a reward, right, whether voluntary or involuntary, then we can sort of meet people where they are. The work of the movement, in order for us to move forward, is not to make people feel ashamed or bad of their race, right? Feel bad about their race. It's getting them to understand unearned advantages, disadvantages, right? And how they are all part of this systemic system that it is our responsibility to make more equitable, right? And I think like that's really where the work is. And that's a lot to squeeze into an hour.
Yeah.
So we could keep having, I wish we could keep having
I
this
know.
conversation. Do you think it's better to be color blind or color obsessed or somewhere in the middle?
I'll let you go, Catherine.
Yeah, I think we know we don't want to be colorblind. We want to be able to really embrace and honor and recognize everyone's full identity when we're talking about their race and also all the other aspects of who they are and what they love and what they're into. But when we focus only on being colorblind, then we're ignoring a big piece of people's experiences in the world and things that might be really important to them. But then the antidote to that is not to only see race in people and not reduce them to their race only, because then we forget their humanity. So I think it's really important. And what we try and do with Rebecca Not Becky is say, okay, let's create this world of Rolling Hills, Virginia, where there's lots of characters who recognize one another and see one another and want to be in community with one another. And they don't ignore one another's race, but they also understand that everyone has a lot of other shared emotions and experiences that can bring us all together.
I want to share just really quickly some thoughts, especially when it comes to children, because I know your book is about a student, and I have two very, very young children, and it's great to watch them because they don't know anything about religion or color, or I mean, they know a little, very little bit, but not enough to have a conversation like this. And to see them playing, my son had a birthday party, and it was, several Black kids, several Hispanic kids, a lot of Asian kids, Indian kids, obviously, and also white. I mean, it was the whole spectrum. And they play, they have fun. There is no, you're this color, I'm this color, you're this religion, I'm this religion. And the parents are also very respectful of culture and food. When we have parties, we tend to get our ethnic food, and just very, very respectful. And they've taught me a lot about, hey, kids just want to have fun. They just want to play with each other and do their homework together and have fun. Like those are the basic foundations for friendship. And then I also think about the privilege that my kids have, because I think about my own upbringing. I'm the children of immigrants. My parents came here with next to nothing, like something like $10 in their pocket. And then I look at my kids now, and they're staying at we're taking them to 5-star hotels and resorts and flying business class. And they have this nice, almost new construction home that they're growing up in. And they're going to these very lavish birthday parties and other types of parties. I say, hey, yes, my kids are privileged. And that's because mommy and daddy earned that privilege.
Yeah, I mean, I think children can teach us so much just in their innocence, right? And in Rebecca Not Becky, that's one of the reasons why we chose, their children to sort of be at the crux of this friendship, this relationship that these women are sort of forced into, right? Because it's not that children don't see color. It's just that is what is not most important to them. What is most important to them is, do we like the same things? Do we wear the same clothes? Do we, are we willing to go on the same adventures? Are you talkative? Am I talkative? You know what I mean? Like, and so they teach us so much about just accepting and embracing and getting to know people for who they are, right? And what they have to offer this world. And I think, again, children are so different from adults in that regard. And so that is why we sort of use them as a vehicle to say, these women would probably never they wouldn't have as many conversations as they're having, let alone even entertain the idea of a friendship, if not for their children becoming fast friends quickly, because hey, we're wearing the same thing. You like the same things I like. Let's go have fun together. Right. And so that's really the lesson. And as Catherine said, we don't want people to ignore race. This book is a book about womanhood, friendship, adulting, motherhood, all of these different complexities of life that we're all navigating daily. but it does not ignore race. Anything else you want to say to close us out, Catherine?
No, that's great. We really appreciated this. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you. And the website is two different websites. I am Christine Platt. That's Platt. I am ChristinePlatt.com, and also Catherine WiggingtonGreene.com. Wigginton. And then Greene has an E at the end. Greene. Catherine WiggingtonGreene.com. Thank you, Christine and Catherine, for joining us on the Work From Home Show. To all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. That's www.workfromhomeshow.com. Get on our mailing list if you have any questions. hello@workfromhomeshow.com. And until next week, keep on working from home.